Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of NatCon Australia. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Daniel Pitt. Dr. Pitt is an honorary research fellow at the University of Buckingham and is also a member of the Centre for British Politics at the University of Hull. He has written extensively for British publications such as The Critic magazine, The Daily Express, Conservative Home, and for American publications such as Law and Liberty and the Imaginative Conservative. He was a student of the late Roger Scruton. He recently edited a book on post-liberalism and the future of conservatism with Philip Blond. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful, and I'm so pleased to see that the National Conservatives in Australia Institute being founded. It's wonderful to see. I think that it's incredibly needed, and it's great to see it in Australia, a country that I'm very fond of.
Yeah, the origin story, for those who don't know, is that I was at the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship event in London last year, and I was talking to a few of the very erudite new right types, including Miriam Cates, who I'm sure you've heard of and know.
I know Miriam, yes.
Yeah, and I was chatting to her, and she said, "Oh, Dan," after her speech, which I congratulated her on, I said, "You touched on a lot of NatCon themes," and she said, "Oh, yes, I did. Of course, that's what I'm about. What's going on with national conservatism in Australia?" And the answer to that was not much at all. So that prompted me to pull some people together who I knew were on the same page to fill that gap, plant the flag, what you will. And we've been doing it now for 6 months plus. And there is definitely a need for it here. So with that big kind of throat clearing, I thought I'd ask to kick things off. The UK, especially in the last couple of years, has a stack of interesting and erudite columnists, public intellectuals, podcasters on the political right. Douglas Murray, David Goodhart, Peter Hitchens, Matthew Goodwin, Constance Kisson, Louise Perry, and your former Professor Roger Scruton, amongst many. I've left out many names there. Yeah. However, the UK itself, politically, from whatever brand of politics you follow on the right, is, I think, a bit of a basket case in many ways, right? And behind America, the situation in America and Australia as well. What do you think explains the disconnect between the ideas and the practical results in Britain?
Well, that's a great question. I think there are two things. That conservatism really operates on two different levels. You've got the political side via political parties, and then you've got the political conservative philosophy, which may or may not be connected to a political party. So you've got people like the American Russell Kirk, T.S. Eliot. You've got people like John Betjeman, who thought that conservatism was cultural, spiritual, religious, and so forth. And then you've got a party that has to try and put this into practice. And the British Conservative Party, after Margaret Thatcher, went into a bit of navel gazing. We had John Major; he did well to win the 1992 election, and then Tony Blair came along, which sent ripples through British politics, especially those on the right. That how do you defeat him? Do you become more like him, or do you oppose him? And Cameron came along and said that he was the heir to Blair. And the Conservative Party took a lot of Blairite positions, and they attract, my view is that they attract liberals who want government. So they would probably feel more at home in Liberal Democrats in terms of their position, their views, their liberal beliefs. But they know that the Liberal Democrats are very rarely going to be in government, so they come into the Conservative Party. And that means that a small group like the Common Sense Group or the New Conservatives, Miriam Cates and Danny Kruger, you've got this small group of what you would say traditionalist conservatives still left in the party, but the big dominant wing are liberals in their essence. So this creates a disconnect between the party and commentators and the philosophy.
Yeah, and then there's just practical. Well, there's a lot of luck of the moment as well in politics, and sometimes you just happen to have the right philosophy but the wrong time, or vice versa, right? So
timing is really important. That if you catch the time right, and also that ideas take a long time to come through into fruition. Russell Kirk used to write about that. Reagan coming through in the US took 30 years, writing in the 1950s, books coming out in the 1950s, created the Goldwater campaign, which then led on to Reagan. So national conservative ideas are they're old. They're not a new thing. That the idea of the nation being at the heart of conservative thought has a long history, a deep one, but the movement is still relatively new. So this will take a long time to bleed in.
Yeah, well, we may not have time. Who knows?
Yes, exactly. That's the problem.
Is there something particularly structural about the UK? There is an overrepresentation of Oxford graduates. London is such a dominant city compared to Australia. It would be the equivalent of Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne combined almost.
Yes.
And there's a certain different type of politician in Australia. We have many faults and flaws. I'm not holding ourselves up as the example to be followed in many ways, but it is. I feel like Westminster and the Boris Johnson types, and even and others, there's a very performative element to it all, whereas that doesn't exist to the same degree in Australia. There's a lot of people reenacting, I think at least, sort of Oxford Union debates. We don't quite have the same type of culture. It's all very impressive, and it's it's clever and it's erudite, but but the result of it often is that you don't get, at least in my view, the same type of focus on practical results or feel for the nation as a whole. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
I would say that the London-centric criticism is absolutely right. I think that's absolutely right. That some studies have shown that if you take London out of the UK is actually a reasonably poor country. It's not doing very well. So if you put London back in, it's one of the richest countries in the world. So it's dominantly economically, but it's also dominantly cultural in its cultural influence, and that is different from the rest of the country. It's more multicultural, it's more liberal, it's more cosmopolitan, and you can see the impact on the media on that shapes it, and the narratives that go around it. Interesting that we just had in London a farmers' protest, and you can see that then the countryside impacting on the town rather than the town impacting on the countryside, which is usually the case especially when there is a Labour administration.
It's interesting you talk about liberals in the UK as being those that are opposed to conservatism or a different political tradition. The problem in Australia, at least, or something it's probably not as well appreciated in the UK as it should be, is our party on the centre right, the main one, is called the Liberal Party. And so while it's claimed by people like John Howard that it's a custodian of both liberal thought and conservative thought, I think that wouldn't have made a lot of sense to an Disraeli or Gladstone, right? It would have been like talking, and there's this contradiction here, but also because the party is named the Liberal Party, it really does see itself as an extension of the British Liberal Party of the 19th century. And so conservatism doesn't have the same, we haven't produced a Roger Scruton, we haven't produced a Kirk. When the party gets together for its anniversary, and it's been a very successful party, Liberal Party, it talks about 80 years of liberalism. Now that's not what the Conservative Party in UK does, although probably, what's in a name, as Shakespeare says, arguably the Conservative Party in the UK is probably more liberal in some ways than the Liberal Party in Australia. But yeah. So what do you make of that? Do you think that's properly appreciated when people have these very interesting and thoughtful conversations about conservatism and its future in places like the UK?
I don't think people appreciate that in Australia as much as that the centre-right party is the Liberal Party. It's interesting that my auntie and uncle, that they live in Australia, just down the road from you, I believe, that they're on the Gold Coast, and they also say that, oh, it's the Conservative Party, that people translate it straight away when they're talking to us Brits. If you see the Liberal Party referred to in British newspapers, they're referred to as the Conservative Party, just so people are aware what it means. But of course, in the Gold Coast, it's in Queensland, it's different, isn't it? Because the Liberal Party is in a coalition there.
There's more complications here. We have a national party, which is different, sort of representing the country interests, which you guys don't really have, and there's no real analog to that in US or even Canadian politics, I don't think. It's interesting. I mean, again, it's probably not as well appreciated in the UK as it should be, but you've got, here we have sort of our share of public intellectuals, at least, that write books about the history of liberalism in Australia. People like David Kemp, and I guess George Brandis, you'd put in, former Attorney General, you put into that camp. But they are explicit in saying things like Menzies never described him. Sir Robert Menzies, our longest-serving centre-right PM, never described himself as a conservative. And there is something outside of Canada where New World political parties don't describe themselves as conservative parties, right? The Republicans are the Republicans. In New Zealand, I think they may have had a part. There's been lots of iterations, but they're the national party at the moment. There's no conservative party as such in Australia in name. What do you make of that? Why would that be the case, do you think?
Well, Menzies, of course, was original party was the Nationalist Party, wasn't it?
Yes.
That's where he started off, and I think that his legacy, and it happens with a lot of politicians, on trade, for example, is not discussed because it doesn't fit the narrative of the liberal free trading narrative. He was, of course, a protectionist. His view of immigration into Australia is, of course, not well known and expressed because he dominantly advocated a European immigration. So this happens a lot with politicians, that we try to pull the bits that we like from them, and we ignore the bits that we don't like so much. When it comes to political narratives and so on, I do think that the reason why some of the New World elements don't use conservative is because they think it was attached to, they have a sort of an old Tory view of what conservatism is, that it's monarchy, Church of England, aristocracy, and in the New World doesn't have that, which is, of course, apart from in English speaking world, apart from America, that's not true. Australia has a king, New Zealand has a king, Canada has a king, and so on. The aristocracy is not there in the same way, of course, and the relationship with the Church of England is slightly different. So I think that's why they don't use the term conservative historically, but it is starting to come back, as we can see, having an institute like this is coming in and looking like at the national element, protection of the nation state. And I think these things the family are coming back into the fore. And I think when politics turns on to culture, the conservative label is much more useful, expressing and telling people what a conservative is and what a conservative wishes to do.
My explanation is that the Liberal Party was formed in Australia, at least, was formed in 1943. I had a friend of yours, Dr. Kit Cowley, wrote an interesting book about all the different discussions that were being had in Britain at the time about what sort of post-war political future and program should be adopted by the Conservative Party. In Australia, there were all those discussions going on, and one of the results was this party called the Australian Liberal Party, and it was a new world. It was a new party, and I think part of the reason why they took that name was it was part of a liberal age. You know, everything had been smashed to pieces in the Second World War, so there was liberalism. At least does provide a bit of a kind of guide for what sort of framework I suppose you should be using in that age. And you're able to be more liberal on trade and other things because of the dominance of the United States providing underwriting security and everything else. So there was sort of, it was a time for it. What do you, we've sort of jumped around the issue. What do you understand by the term national conservatism? How does it differ from other brands of conservatism, if indeed it does differ?
Well, there's lots of similarities with others. It's not, completely separate as far as I'm concerned, but it elevates culture. It says that culture matters. Many of our politics says economics is first, and you prioritize the economy, and things like family formation, the impact of community, the idea of the nation state being the political unit that should be utilized internationally, and the impact of having a patriotic conservatism rather than a more of a cosmopolitan conservatism. So it pushes the emphasis on culture more, or it links culture more explicitly to the economy. Okay, if we're worried about family formation and low fertility rates, what type of economy do we need to support that? What type of policies do we need to support that in that way? So it's family, community, nation, faith. These are much more elevated in importance, whereas in other conservatisms, you could say that they're there in the background, perhaps, but for example, libertarians emphasize the economy, they emphasize individual freedom, they emphasize that getting and spending is a positive because it creates economic growth. That's some of the differences.
It's certainly being used a lot more, the term. As you well know, Yoram Hazony, the Israeli-American intellectual, certainly has promoted it. But so have mainstream politicians now. I mean, Miriam Cates uses it and says we need national conservatism. There is Matthew Goodwin, the public intellectual in the UK, says this is national conservatism is the future. J.D. Vance speaks at the National Conservative Conference in Washington, D.C. just prior to the American election. Donald Trump is also, although not a political philosopher, sort of has I think the right instincts and has talked about liking the term being national conservative in one of his kind of free-form speeches. So it's not as though this is a kind of, I don't know, overly wonky academic sort of subject that has no real relevance to life, because which is sometimes what I've encountered here in Australia when discussing the term. People don't quite understand it, but it really is the new kind of governing framework for the age in which we live in, or at least on the right. It's also, I think, it's a response and a critique of the liberalism which has dominated in economics, in foreign policy, and in immigration, open borders liberalism, since the 80s, or arguably since the 80s, but at least in the post-Cold War world, right? And it's not a Margaret Thatcher tribute band. It certainly has some sort of harsher things to say about the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, right?
Well, I think that's right. That national conservatives want to look at things that conservatives previously have not done so well and prioritize those, but I also think that conservatism looks at, or should, when it's done properly, should look at what are the problems of today that Thatcher, for example, and Reagan, inflation was a big problem. In the UK, it was trade union power. And in the United States, it was about the Make America Great Again is not from Trump, it's from Reagan. He originally said that because they had the malaise of the 1970s, they had stagflation, and that's what they were dealing with. So you can see why the emphasis was on the economics, is to sort out the economics, where conservatives of national conservatives of that stripe are looking and saying, what are our problems today? Well, we've got family breakdown, we've got reduction of the amount of people getting married, we've got people getting divorced, we have people not knowing their culture, we've got an attack from the woke left of our institutions, our history, and we have got a community breakdown, loneliness. We've got individuals feeling more lonely than ever in many aspects. We've got mental health problems. Where does this stem from? We've got families not eating food at the dinner table. So national conservatives are emphasizing these things because this is the problems that we have today, and that's what we need to focus on. And that's one thing that is like, that's why we're saying, okay, Reagan and Thatcher were marvelous. They did great things. They were great people and great statesmen, but their problems were different and our problems are different. So what strand of conservatism can we use to help us today? And that's the national conservatism strand.
Yeah, I don't think you're 100% right. The challenges that they face are different. The challenges we face today, they didn't have. Reagan was not into you transforming the world by invading other countries in a foreign policy sense. He's actually, despite his sort of hawkish reputation and his eyeballing of the Soviet Union, he actually didn't invade very many countries at all. Grenada and bombed Libya, and then I think Lebanon was there for a little bit too, but that's it. Margaret Thatcher reclaimed the Falklands, but that was the Falklands, and then she hung around for the first Cold War. Reagan was long since gone by then. So who knows how they would have reacted? Mass immigration wasn't an issue in the same way for the United States. Margaret Thatcher did actually say, that she was worried about Britain being swamped by immigrants in the early days, and that was probably, arguably, got her a bit of traction in more blue collar communities than her spouting, Hayekian sort of spontaneous order sort of doctrines. And Reagan was, at least when he was running again, was very focused on things like, which seem obscure, but certainly had a national conservative flavor, like ensuring that the Panama Canal stayed in American hands. It wasn't going to give it away and bow a knee to the sort of liberal internationalist order, because that's what you should have done. So, you could argue that in this current age, they may have been, much more Nat Connie, and they certainly were more, I think, conservative than they're given credit for. They were about reinvigorating the economy, but there was elements to it all which were not as, they certainly, and all sorts of restrictions came off in the post-Cold War world, and they had been sort of long gone since that time. And a lot of the problems we have sort of stem from that post-Cold War rather than the kind of Reagan-Thatcher revolution per se, right? What about, you wrote a book with Philip Blond, and he popularized the term red Toryism. Is that right?
That's right.
And so these things, red Toryism and blue Labour, which don't really exist in Australia. What are they, and do they differ at all from national conservatism?
Well, that's an excellent question. Well, Philip Blond's red Tory, let's start with that. Essentially, red Tory, in a simple way, essentially argue that the right and left have both had negative impacts on community. And the right, by idealizing the market and putting market solutions in place where there shouldn't be a market solution, has impacted. And then the left utilizing the state. And so that is a sort of one insight from red Tory. Red. So red means that the red bit is that the utilization of civil society more, the utilization of the state more, in creating a flourishing family and community. So that's the red bit, and the Tory bit is then the family, community, and so on. Philip Blond differs from the National Conservatives is that he thinks that there is the nation. He believes in empire. Put it that way. He believes in empire, and he thinks that it should be universalized. That essentially more of a Christian society across.
What's his background for those that aren't as familiar? Did he come from the Conservative side or the Liberal side or the Labor side to this position?
Well,
or?
He said to me, the thing that brought he studied theology for his PhD at Peterhouse, Cambridge. He did an undergraduate at the University of Hull, where I currently teach. Loads of great people come from Hull.
And we lost.
So abortion brought him into pro-life movement, brought him into politics. That's what he said to me. That's the thing that brought him into politics. So that brought him into politics. Blue Labour, in a way, have similar viewpoints to red Tories, but they would be more in favour of trade unions. They would be more in favour of mutualist groups where working class people support each other, create mutuals, building societies. They would emphasise that, more corporatist in its economics, in the sense of that they would want workers on boards or that sort of thing. So they have a different emphasis on the type of economy that they would like to see, but they're both more communitarian than individualistic in their viewpoint. And they see both elevate or want to support working class people in their view that this is a fundamental thing to do. So I think that they wouldn't prioritize the nation as much as on the nation state as much as Nat Cons do, or even they may reject it.
What about trade, immigration, and foreign policy? Where do red Tories fit on that?
I'm not so sure about where that would be for red Tories. With immigration, I definitely would say they, taking off from their own theorizing, you would say that because they prioritize social cohesion. So if you prioritize social cohesion, then you would have to have a reduced amount of immigration, and immigration that could then be
you just cut out for a second. Yeah, so you were explaining about how red Toryism isn't as clear potentially on some of those other issues on trade and immigration. One question I had is that that red Toryism that kicked off 10 plus years ago, didn't it? When that book came out, it's old, and you had sort of politicians in the UK rocking along to these events and giving speeches and sort of saying it's an interesting. And you had the big kind of Brexit, which is a sort of, a national conservative type of event.
Yes.
And then you had Boris Johnson win that election on basis of national conservative type of arguments, taking back control, being able to take control of trade and immigration and leveling up and all the rest of it. But it's almost as though when they won the Conservative Party in the UK a dramatic victory, and deep into sort of red wall territory, they didn't understand why they had won, or at least Boris Johnson didn't. And so literally after winning, I remember him rocking down to Greenwich and giving a great, very Boris Johnson style speech, talking about free trade and talking basically like a 19th century liberal.
Yes.
And then not really getting the immigration stuff at all, to put it mildly. I mean, mass immigration just went up through the roof. and then being very liberal internationalist on wars in Ukraine, famously, and other things. I mean, how does someone so bright miss the point? It confounds one.
Yeah. Well, Boris, I think from supporters of Boris like me, who did what we wanted him to do in many ways, that get Brexit done, get it over the line, finish Jeremy Corbyn, finish him off, get rid of his career, and annihilate him at an election. So for me, he achieved those two core goals that I wanted to see him do: win an election, get Brexit done, finish Jeremy Corbyn. There you go. That. Everything else for me was let's see what happens. Yeah. So in that way, he achieved what I wanted him to achieve. I think the election, though, in 2019 was the Conservative Party didn't come to terms with actually its electoral coalition had changed, and they didn't understand that deeply enough, that this had changed and what was desired from it had changed. And that's difficult, because if you are people who've been advocating a certain type of policies for a long time, and then you have this big election win, and then you're asked to change direction because of there's a big electoral win, I think that's difficult to do. And the Conservative Party in Britain is made up of different groups. You've got the liberals socially, you've got the economic liberals, you've got the difference between types of green, the Scruton type greens that are interested in the countryside and country pursuits and beautiful architecture and these sort of greens, or you got the greens which are more globalist, net zero. So you got this tension as well. You've got the tension about who should the Conservatives prioritize. Should it be the working classes, or should it be the middle class liberals in the urban areas? And because it's a big coalition, it needs someone at the top with firm leadership to say, look, this is where we're going, this is what we're going to do, here's the vision. People might not buy into that, but it's still a vision to give the party direction. Of course, as Harold Macmillan is usually described as saying, events, dear boy, events. And COVID knocked the Conservative Party majorly off course and implemented things that you wouldn't necessarily say were conservative in nature.
No, not at all. So what? I mean, it's a British understatement, I suppose. It is odd. I mean, what you're describing, despite the differences in names, is very similar to Australia in many ways. And there's a problem because the traditional seats, the blue ribbon seats that have been held by the party for so long, both here and in the UK, they are where all the members are, they're where all the donors are. And while they may like to say they're on the side of people in the UK, the Red Wall or outer suburban and other parts, the branch network and all the practical means of actually getting votes are not very strong out there. And people, and so, in scripture, it's, where your treasure is, there your heart lies also. And if all your members are located in, I think almost 50% of the members in Victoria are located in the seat of Kooyong, which is now held by effectively a Green. Yes. So that's an issue. And I imagine, I hazard a guess that it's not dissimilar in the UK.
Not at all.
Yeah. So look, there's a lot of work to do, and it does require a lot of practical restructuring, and as well as big thinking and all the rest of it. Podcasters in Melbourne, in London, and Brisbane won't win the day in the end. But I think it's useful to sort of give people a framework for thinking about the new world in which they live, and hopefully direct some of the guys like that are in power to appreciate that it's not just they can't just sort of rehashing the glorious 80s again and again and expecting that's appropriate for the times in which we live. Your book was called Post-liberalism and the Future of Conservatism. I mean, what do you mean by post-liberalism exactly?
Well, that was one of the heart of the book. So there are multiple contributors in it, and part of it was trying to define what is post-liberalism. That's very hard to get down to the brass tacks to. So it's really about, in many ways, my understanding is that what relationship should conservatism have with liberalism, at the intellectual level, but also in the strategic level. That you can see that on things like free speech, the liberals would be ideal strategic partners, but also about conservatives need to create their own intellectual identity, because we prioritize different things. We're not like John Stuart Mill, who thinks that we should be liberated from tradition, custom, and society, and you've got the individual purely liberated from society. Actually, we think society creates us. It's actually, we are created through the society and become individuals from that. That, of course, it's very, every single person has a mark on their human body from that. We are not purely an individual. We didn't come into the world strong, independent. We became into the world weak and needy, and that mark is our belly button. We literally came into the world attached to our mother, and society develops and creates us, and the culture around us, history, positively impacts on the individual. So that was one of the key things. We had some contributors who argued that liberalism is a friend, and liberalism, it should be included in conservative thought, and we had some more who were less willing to go along those lines and say that they are still competitors, like Disraeli or Salisbury or so.
Yeah.
Saying.
Yeah.
To me, that's the thing, because conservatives have had to, previously liberals were the foe. In the Victorian era, it was liberals, but then socialists grew so strong that we had to align ourselves with liberals to be able to push back against the socialists and the communists.
Yeah.
Some say, has that threat gone? Therefore, we can then go our separate ways again. Some say, no, that hasn't gone. The woke ideology is incredibly strong, and conservatives and liberals have to stand side by side.
Yeah, I mean, liberals and conservatives often can agree that the symptoms are bad. Cracking down on speech, conservatives and liberals, fight side by side. But I think liberals and conservatives differ as to the causes of that, right? Why we have these symptoms. And so, there's a possible, you can partner with them on a particular level, but there is, and I don't think this is underappreciated, certainly in Australia, liberalism can be a very destructive philosophy. Because it focuses on maximizing individual freedom above all else, and thinks all laws should be assessed on that basis of whether it's maximizing individual freedom, and it doesn't provide structures for the support of the family. It doesn't have any view on whether birth rate should be good up or down in a nutshell. It can't really explain why nations exist, or why there should be borders from people crossing nations, or goods crossing nations, duty free, or why a nation like Britain shouldn't feel as attached to the citizens of Ukraine as it does to its own people, right? So there are problems with liberalism, and it is, as long as you recognize that, at least in my view, and at least as long as you recognize what the issues are as a conservative, you can kind of pick the battles that you want to fight, join together on it, and then. But I think ultimately they are irreconcilable types of philosophies, right? They're different strands, and because of the success of the sort of Reagan Thatcher times, and indeed the post-war Cold War era, the tension wasn't as obvious, I suppose, for a while at least, but now it is, and so at the very least, the liberals, I think, need to appreciate that you can't keep running the same argument again and again. You recognize there must be some problems with this philosophy that you're advocating. So yeah, it's certainly, I've certainly, so what does then the future of conservatism look like?
Well,
Daniel?
that was, well, I would be cheeky and say, read my book. So that's one way of finding out. But from my personal perspective, the future of conservatism was an emphasis on culture, understanding that culture matters. Institutions matter too. We need to look at institutions that are prospering, doing well, but also the ones that are failing. This is something that some view of conservatives forget. They think it's just a process of change, change conserve. They normally quote Burke, but actually there's the view tried and tested. This institution has been tried, it's been tested, found to fail. You replace it with something new, which is something closer to the lines of your principles. I call this a substantive view of conservatism. I think that it should be beautiful. The future of conservatism should be beautiful. Beauty matters. It's a human need. Our architecture matters. The type of buildings that we build. As Churchill said, we build our buildings, we influence them, and then they influence us. So people who live near to heritage, recent research has found, are much happier, much more have well-being levels when they live next to heritage, because guess what? They are proud of the place that they live. So actually, it should be beautiful. We can conserve the urban area. I think that we should we need to understand that markets have a huge role to play. Hume and Smith were quite clear that mechanism that markets provides us with the wealth and prosperity we need. But also there are places where we don't want a market. You may say in pornography or selling of sex. Don't want a market in that. We want to keep the market in its proper place. I think future of conservatism needs to have a religious element to it. I think that faith and if it's not explicit, but at least the underpinning of its thought, it needs to have some foundations to build off. And the idea of that, if people are in a patriotic, yes, our country's got things wrong because we are human beings running countries, and human beings are flawed, and we should forgive the things that go wrong, but teach a culture of affirmation, to love your culture, to love the place that you're from, and to pass that on to your children. So that's, in a nutshell, what I think where future of conservatism should go.
Yeah, and there are historical strains to all of those things, right? In some ways, it's just reasserting what people in the past, conservative thinkers, have said, but which we have kind of forgotten. We haven't focused as much, I think, the political parties, the centre-right political parties, on ensuring that our traditions, our culture, our things of beauty are passed on from one generation to the next. The focus instead has been, let's make the society as free as possible and break down all barriers and all the rest of it, and people can do what they will. And there was a need for that at some point, but there are, like all things, it can be pushed to extremes. So what? Just to wrap up, what next for you? I mean, people should go, like you said, and read your book. Have you, the Post-liberalism and the Future of Conservatism with Philip Blond. What are your next projects that you're working on and hope to contribute to?
So I've got a couple of books I'm working on. One is the Conservative Party and the Constitution, and the other one I'm working on is free speech. Free speech within history, its conceptualizations of free speech, and then looking at Roger Scruton and Russell Kirk in particular and their views on free speech. So those are two book projects. And we've got a big conference coming up next year in America, in Grand Rapids in June, where we'll be looking at the Anglo-American intellectual conservative tradition. So those are a few things that I'm up to.
Yeah, great stuff. And you're on Twitter, and people can no doubt find you on your academic website as well, Dr. Daniel Pitt. I've really appreciated the discussion. There's lots of other areas which I could really get into as well, but for the purposes of this podcast, I'll keep it at a particular level. Lovely to make the connection, and look forward to speaking to you again in future as we push this forward. National conservatism for the win.
Yeah, absolutely. National conservatism in Australia. That's what I like to hear.
Great
Wonderful
stuff. We're doing our best.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, mate. Appreciate it. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.